Billy, our top story continues to be Minnesota with so many seemingly moving parts.
Yeah, the fallout continues this morning, Mika, from the fatal shooting of 37-year-old ICU nurse at the VA, Alex Preddy. MS Now has obtained the first official timeline of the incident, which undercuts many of the statements made by Trump administration officials in the immediate aftermath of the killing. A preliminary review from U.S. Customs and Border Protection makes no mention of Preddy brandishing a weapon or intending to do maximum damage and kill law enforcement, as Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and other officials claimed. The report, which was sent to lawmakers yesterday, also reveals 2 federal agents fired at Preddy after they say he resisted arrest. Questions remain about what exactly led agents to fire the fatal shots. When it comes to the investigation, sources tell MS Now the Justice Department has decided there will be no civil rights probe into the shooting. Instead, a Customs and Border Protection office will investigate its own officers, and another DHS unit, which normally focuses on human trafficking and national security threats, will look into whether Preddy broke any laws. Minnesota's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension says it is separately investigating the shooting, but has not been given access to any evidence or information from federal agencies. Meanwhile, White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller appears to be distancing himself from the Department of Homeland Security amid growing criticism over Saturday's shooting. Miller, who initially labeled Alex Preddy as an assassin and a domestic terrorist, now says Customs and Border Protection agents in Minneapolis, quote, may not have been following proper protocol. In a statement shared yesterday with MS Now, Miller wrote, the White House provided clear guidance to DHS that the extra personnel that had been sent to Minnesota for force protection should be used for conducting fugitive operations to create a physical barrier between the arrest teams and the disruptors. We're evaluating why the CBP team may not have been following that protocol. David Rode, significant politically because Stephen Miller is the architect of all of this, that he would distance himself in any way from what's happening in Minnesota. But to go back to the investigation for just a moment, this follows the pattern of the shooting death of Renee Good, which is federal agencies say, we'll handle this, we'll look into this. And as much as the Minnesota local and state officials are trying to investigate it, they're still not getting cooperation from the federal government.
Yeah, I came here this morning, wanted to talk about some of the big changes that have happened. The president has changed his tone. That's very significant. And you've got more Republicans following that way, speaking out in Congress like they haven't before. The attempt by Stephen Miller to separate himself from this, given what he said, given what he has said now for more than a decade about immigration, is false, I would say, or just unrealistic. And he was one of the primary backers of Kristi Noem and Bovino and others who carried out these aggressive tactics. So it's really Miller's responsibility here. It'll be interesting to see the dynamics inside the administration. And on the investigation, you're right. This is going to lead, by keeping it so small, by not sharing information with the state's officials, it's just going to lead to perceptions it's a cover-up. There should be a civil rights investigation. That's a higher level. Did they violate Alex Preddy's civil rights? And that opens up a whole other way of investigating this and possibly prosecuting these officers who shot him.
Fascinating intrigue inside the White House, Jonathan Lemire, with Stephen Miller putting a little distance anyway, for now, between himself and what happened in Minnesota. And also you have Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, who got called into the principal's office on Monday night to talk to President Trump. He yesterday was speaking in support, effectively, of Secretary Noem, trying to shoot down some of the rumors that say she's on thin ice, she's about to get fired. Even Republican senators now saying she should resign, but President Trump at least publicly supporting her for now. What's your sense of how long she may last? Is she secure in the job?
Yeah, a couple of Republican senators, I believe Tillerson and Murkowski, said that she should resign. White House telling me yesterday as well, I put this very question to them, they say no, the president has full confidence in Secretary Noem. Now, that's a phrase that doesn't always mean a heck of a lot when it comes to Donald Trump. But we know that he's tried to not have anywhere near the turnover that defined Trump 1.0. He'd like to keep his people in place. But you're right, there are real divides opening up within the administration here. Miller even going on to say that his statement right after the shooting that this was a would-be assassin, meaning Preti, was because of the information he was supplied by Border Patrol agents on the scene. So he's sort of pointing the finger there. The head of Border Patrol, Rodney Scott, has had a difficult relationship at times with Secretary Noem and Stephen Miller. Tom Homan and Noem have had issues, I am told, over the last year or so about the right approach to how to carry out operations like this. But Mika, there's no question that Homan met with local officials yesterday in Minnesota, trying to take the temperature down. He said, we have some disagreements, but we're trying to make this work. Right now, there's clearly an effort to step back a little in Minnesota. We should not, however, read into that as a broad course correction on immigration operations throughout the country. It's just simply way too soon to know.
Well, the mayor and the governor want ICE out. They want ICE out. The thousands of ICE agents that have descended upon Minneapolis alone have created a chaos that they believe led to this moment. Some might ask, have we heard anything more than words from the president on down and Bovino? Words and Bovino. But what actually has changed? It's only been a few days, but it's still possible to make sweeping change, to do things that show actionably that things are going to change. What has happened? Is Homan moving people out? How many? How many ICE agents are still operating in Minnesota and Minneapolis specifically? Have the two ICE agents, apparently now two, who fired shots that killed Alex Preti, have they been put on administrative leave? Have the 9 or so agents who were all swarmed around him and taking him down to the ground, are they on administrative leave, which would be proper procedure, something that Tom Homan said that he respected? He thought it was unprofessional to rush to judgment. I would also wonder about procedure being followed. When you have a officer-involved killing, usually that officer is put on administrative leave so you can bear out the investigation and also not have a traumatized officer out in the field. So we'll see about that. And also, I think it's fair to ask, before I get to Barbara McQuade, have those in the highest power, Kristi Noem, Stephen Miller, J.D. Vance, Scott Bessent, been held accountable for jumping to the defense of ICE when they had absolutely no reason to, no information that would lead them to say what they said, and quite frankly, mocking Second Amendment rights? Have they apologized? Have they not just sort of walked it back and talked about something else? Have they said they were wrong to rush to judgment and possibly defame this potential victim in a killing? Let an investigation bear out to see what really happened. If you don't know what happened, you can't really say that someone is an assassin like Stephen Miller did. So that's another thing. And also mocking him and criticizing him for using his Second Amendment rights, carrying a weapon. The president, Scott Bessent, still sticking to that, which is curious. So let's bring in former U.S. Attorney and MS Now legal analyst Barbara McQuade. Barbara, I'm just curious, from your analysis, what has changed legally in the federal or state arena on this? Is the state going to be allowed to do an investigation, which I believe they have a right to, or are the feds still holding this close? And what about evidence from the scene? Does the state get to examine the evidence? What's going on here? What has really changed?
Yeah, you ask all the right questions, Mika. It reminds me of when a football team fires its head coach when it's having a losing season and then tries to appease its fans to say, there, now the problem is solved. But you've got the same old players and the same old playbook. Nothing is going to change with the success of the team. And so I think we need some sizable changes on the ground in Minneapolis, and frankly, at the leadership levels all the way up the chain. I am concerned. I worked with ICE as a U.S. attorney with its various components, and I worry that what they are doing with ICE in Minneapolis is such an abuse of law enforcement protocols that it's just going to have to be either renamed or dismantled. They are doing decades of damage, and not only to ICE, but to every other law enforcement agency, because public trust is so critically important to its ability to work with law enforcement. But the idea that there's going to be no criminal investigation by the Department of Justice here is absolutely absurd. We have so many unanswered questions about what happened here, and the likelihood of some criminal liability certainly exists in light of what was happening with these agents on the ground. You know, there's a very high bar for holding law enforcement officers criminally accountable for mistakes, poor judgment, panicking, those kinds of things. It has to be an intentional deprivation of civil rights. But at this point, we don't know. What were the conversations? What is the evidence? There hasn't been access. And in light of what we're seeing in the federal response, I think it behooves the state to conduct a full investigation. But as you say, although we have a court order now requiring federal law enforcement to preserve the evidence, there has been no indication that state actors are going to have access to it. And getting that access immediately is critically important. You know, months or years later isn't going to do them much good.
And Barbara, under normal circumstances, the department would want to reestablish, or at least attempt to establish, some credibility, some good faith with the public, given that it had told all these lies in both shootings initially about domestic terrorism and assassin, and the sequence of events that people can see with their own eyes was not true, did not match the video. So what is your sense of why in this second case, after everything that happened with Renee Good, with Alex Preddy, why they wouldn't want to at least, we'll have our own internal investigation, but yes, of course, DOJ should look at this as well, and we can get the truth out?
I think really, you know, very cynically, that the goal here is really just to show force. It is to create intimidation. It is to stoke fear. It is political theater. If you were engaging in genuine law enforcement to protect public safety, the approach to this entire operation would be completely different. What we're seeing is just 3,000 agents on the streets of Minneapolis, a blue state with a very small percentage of immigrants in their community. What you'd see instead is targeted enforcement in states like Texas or Florida, where we have more significant numbers of immigrants. And what I mean by targeted enforcement is what ICE has done throughout its history before today. That is, they use intelligence, they use records, they use data to identify people who do have serious criminal records. When I was serving as U.S. attorney, what they would do is compile lists of people with a prior criminal record of aggravated, serious, violent felonies. And then they would spend resources to go find those people and deport them. What we're seeing instead on the streets of Minneapolis is, let's just go around to places where we might find them. Of course, these Kavanaugh stops, with the Supreme Court has now approved, at least temporarily, is we can base our reasonable suspicion on language or appearance or location or somebody's job, and just question people in a dragnet situation. That may yield large numbers, but it isn't going to yield the kinds of people who actually pose a threat to public safety.